David Lawson settled into his seat by the window, the hum of the airplane's engines vibrating through the fuselage. He buckled his seatbelt slowly, trying to ignore the small sting in his back from sitting too long. The air inside the plane smelled faintly of coffee and stale pretzels, the low murmur of voices and the occasional clink of metal trays filling the cabin. It wasn't the worst flight he'd ever been on, but it certainly wasn't the best. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. He was on his way home after attending the memorial service of a friend, another veteran who hadn't made it back from the battlefield. David had been through countless memorials, funerals, and services over the years, but each one always left a hole in his chest, a reminder that time was slipping away and the world was moving on. He had seen so much, lost so much, and while he was grateful for the life he had, the pain of his past was always with him. David was used to the stares, people glancing at him from the corners of their eyes as he walked through airports or sat in waiting areas. He wasn't the young man he had been when he enlisted, and his military jacket, worn with age and service, only made him more of an enigma to the people around him. He could feel their curiosity, their assumptions. They saw a man who had given his youth to a cause they probably didn't understand. But today, as the plane began to taxi down the runway, something felt different. The flight was only a few hours, but David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the weather, or the cramped space, or the noise. It was the weight of the air, heavy with something unspoken. He glanced over at the three young passengers seated a row behind him. The couple was busy talking, their laughter sharp and uncontained. The woman, a petite blonde with a loud voice, kept glancing over at David, her gaze lingering a little too long. Her boyfriend, a tall man with messy hair and a cocky grin, seemed to be equally intrigued. They were young, no older than their early 20s, and carefree, lost in their own world of in-jokes and excitement. And then there was Kyle, their friend sitting next to them. He was tall with an air of arrogance about him, eyes flicking over to David every now and then, sizing him up. David tried to focus on the window again, trying to ignore the way they kept glancing his way. He had been through this 100 times, but something about their laughter, it wasn't just carefree. There was something sharp about it, something that felt too close to mockery. As the plane climbed into the air, the woman's voice rose above the hum of the engines. Do you think he's one of those old soldiers who can't let go of the past? Like, still wearing his jacket everywhere? I bet he's one of those guys who tells the same war story over and over again. When I was in the war, her voice was loud enough that it cut through the noise, and David felt his muscles tense. He hadn't even turned to look at them, but he could feel the mockery in her tone. The couple laughed, and for a moment, the noise around him faded. David's hand gripped the armrest tighter, the heat rising in his chest. It's sad, right? The man next to her, her boyfriend, added. They don't realize that no one cares about their old stories anymore. It's just like a weird obsession. They just want attention. The words stung harder than David anticipated. He had heard similar things before, but the sheer thoughtlessness of it made his stomach churn. He wasn't looking for sympathy, but the callousness, the lack of respect, hit harder than he cared to admit. It reminded him of the very thing he had fought against. People turning their backs on the sacrifices of others without even knowing what those sacrifices meant. David's mind raced, flashes of his time in the service playing like old film reels. He had lived those moments, seen the devastation, the sacrifices, and now, here he was, reduced to a laughingstock by people who probably couldn't fathom the weight of what he had carried for years. It made his blood boil, but his pride wouldn't let him turn around and confront them. They weren't worth it. He had learned to let go of the anger long ago, but sometimes it crept back up, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Kyle, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke, his voice dripping with entitlement. I bet he's just one of those guys who thinks he's still important because he served. Look at him. He's just a reminder of a time that doesn't matter anymore. David's chest tightened. That was it. That was the breaking point. The man hadn't even bothered to look him in the eye, hadn't bothered to understand. But it wasn't just Kyle's words. It was the tone, the certainty with which they spoke, the assumption that what he had done, what he had lived through, meant nothing. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. He could feel their eyes on him now, the weight of their judgment pressing down, the atmosphere around him thick with disdain. But just as he was about to stand up, to move, to find somewhere else to hide from their cruelty, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," the voice announced, calm and authoritative, cutting through the tension that had built up in the cabin. "We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very special passenger on board today. A man who has served his country with honor, a veteran of the armed forces, Mr. David Lawson. Let's all take a moment to thank him for his service, and to remember the sacrifices made by those who protect our freedoms." David froze, his heart beating loudly in his chest. The couple behind him went silent. There was a sharp intake of breath, followed by an awkward shuffle. Kyle's smug grin faltered, replaced by confusion and discomfort. The woman whispered something to him, but her voice was no longer filled with laughter. The plane seemed to hold its breath. "For those of you who may feel uncomfortable," the captain continued, "we ask that you take a moment to reflect on the privilege we have to sit here, in this country, without fear, because of the service of men like Mr. Lawson. And for those who may find it hard to show respect, I suggest you think about the freedoms you enjoy because of his sacrifice." The announcement hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. David could feel his face flush, a mix of surprise, discomfort, and something he hadn't expected: gratitude. The passengers around him shifted in their seats, their eyes moving nervously between one another. He could almost hear the wheels turning in their minds, the realization sinking in that they had crossed a line. And in that moment, David knew that the air had changed. The loud voices from behind him, the mocking tone, had quieted. He wasn't just a veteran now. He was a symbol, a reminder of what people often took for granted. And the very thing they had tried to dismiss, the thing they had tried to trivialize, had just been given the weight it deserved. For the rest of the flight, there was an uneasy stillness in the air. The passengers didn't stare, but they didn't ignore him either. The couple behind him, once full of condescension, now sat in silence, their earlier laughter replaced with the awkward shuffle of shifting eyes. The air was thick with an unspoken understanding, one that didn't need to be voiced. And David, sitting in his seat, finally allowed himself to relax. He hadn't needed to defend himself. He hadn't needed to fight back. Sometimes, respect didn't come from words. It came from the power of silence and the weight of what was unspoken. The moments after the announcement felt like a weight had lifted from David's shoulders. The plane was no longer just a cramped, sterile environment filled with the buzzing of overhead lights and the faint smell of cabin air. It felt almost different now, as though the world had shifted ever so slightly. The teens behind him were quieter, the constant chatter replaced with a hesitant silence. The noise that once filled the cabin now felt distant, muffled, as if everyone was holding their breath. David didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had heard the words of the pilot, felt their weight, and in that moment, something inside him softened. The tension had dissipated, but it wasn't a victorious moment. It was more of a relief. The anger that had flared up earlier seemed distant now, replaced with the quiet satisfaction that, for once, he hadn't had to say a word. The couple behind him shifted uncomfortably, and David could almost hear the internal struggle within them, the sudden awareness that they had made a mistake. The woman, who had been the loudest of them all, now sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze flicking over to her boyfriend, who didn't seem to know how to react. It was clear that their carefree arrogance had faded, replaced with something more akin to guilt. They hadn't expected a lesson. They hadn't expected the weight of their own actions to come crashing down on them in such an immediate public way. As the flight continued, David leaned back in his seat, his eyes trained on the soft clouds outside his window. The soft murmur of the passengers around him became background noise as he let his thoughts wander. The cockpit's announcement had surprised him, even though it had been the right thing to do. He hadn't expected anyone to stick up for him, especially not in such a public way. He didn't think anyone noticed the small, subtle sacrifices he'd made, the things he carried from the war, things he didn't talk about. But sometimes, when the universe decided to step in, it did so in unexpected ways. He hadn't moved. He hadn't reacted to the couple's mockery. He hadn't had to. The pilot had done it for him, giving voice to the respect that had been denied him, not just by these young people, but by the world at large. For once, the weight of his service had been acknowledged, not in a way that was loud or boastful, but in a quiet, dignified way that made him realize something. It wasn't about the recognition. It wasn't about the thank yous. It was about knowing his own worth, about standing tall in the face of everything he had gone through, no matter how the world viewed him. The plane began its descent, the city lights below twinkling like tiny stars in the dark sky. The cabin light dimmed, and David glanced out of the window again, watching the ground come closer with each passing second. A familiar sense of home started to creep in, though he wasn't sure where exactly home was anymore. He had been to so many places, in so many different states of mind, that it was hard to pinpoint a place where he truly felt at peace. But there was something calming about the idea of returning to his quiet life, where he could think in solitude and reflect on what had transpired. As the plane touched down, there was an audible sigh from the passengers around him. The usual rustling of seatbelts, the clicking of bags being opened, filled the cabin as people began to prepare for the end of the flight. David slowly gathered his belongings, standing up and stretching his legs before moving to the aisle. He didn't feel any rush. The chaos that usually followed disembarking didn't bother him anymore. He was used to waiting for others to move before making his way out. It gave him time to breathe. Just as he reached the front of the plane, the woman who had mocked him earlier stood up, her body stiff, as she slowly made her way toward him. David barely looked at her, but out of the corner of his eye, he could see her glancing nervously in his direction. She cleared her throat as she approached him, but she didn't speak right away. There was a long pause where neither of them said anything. David, waiting for the moment to pass, turned his gaze back to the aisle, but she stepped closer, her voice low. "Mr. Lawson," she began, her words hesitant. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." David stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. He had expected to be ignored, perhaps even dismissed, but the sincerity in her voice made him pause. He turned slowly to face her, taking in the uneasy look in her eyes. She was younger than he had imagined, probably not much older than his daughter. Her face flushed with embarrassment, but there was something else in her expression now, regret. I didn't realize who you were," she continued, the words tumbling out. "I didn't mean to disrespect you, I don't know. I was being stupid, and I'm sorry for what I said." She shifted uncomfortably, as if unsure of how to proceed. David studied her for a moment, his mind quiet. Her apology wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't some dramatic attempt to make up for the things she had said. It was simple, and it was real. It was the kind of apology that didn't require anything in return, but one that held weight nonetheless. David had been through too much to hold grudges, but he could still feel the small flicker of forgiveness in his chest. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm and steady. "But it's not just about me, it's about understanding the people you're talking to. The things you say can go a lot further than you think." She nodded, her eyes cast down, perhaps reflecting on his words. David let the silence stretch between them before finally turning to walk off the plane. As he did, he could feel her watching him, and he allowed himself to nod once, a small gesture of acknowledgement. It wasn't about the apology, it was about the lesson they both had learned. The small crowd of passengers filtered out behind him, but David was already moving through the airport, his steps steady, his mind clearer than it had been before the flight. He didn't need their approval, he didn't need their thanks, but he had been seen in a way that mattered, and that, in itself, was enough. David's steps echoed as he walked through the terminal, the noise of the airport bustling around him, but seeming so distant. The usual chaos of arriving passengers, the hurried footsteps, the automated announcements on the loudspeakers, they all seemed muffled, like the world had become slightly out of focus. His thoughts swirled, not just about the apology from the woman, but about the whole strange sequence of events that had unfolded over the past few hours. He had spent so many years in the military, learning how to ignore discomfort, how to push through the pain, how to endure what others would deem unbearable. But nothing in his military training had prepared him for the sting of being dismissed so casually, so thoughtlessly. For a while, he had felt like an outsider in his own country, like the things he had fought for, the ideals, the camaraderie, the sacrifice, had been forgotten by the very people he had sworn to protect. And yet, here he was, just a man with a history, a past full of experiences others couldn't imagine, now facing the awkward apology of someone who didn't even know what she had truly done. He couldn't help but wonder, had she truly understood the weight of her actions? Was this just the polite apology of a young person trying to avoid feeling guilty? Or had she really come to grasp what it meant to treat someone with respect? David wasn't sure, but as he walked away, he felt something he hadn't expected. A sense of quiet acceptance. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something more profound. It was a shift. Maybe she didn't fully understand yet, but maybe, just maybe, she would remember this moment. Remember the way the world had shifted just slightly when the pilot had spoken. Maybe she would think twice the next time she assumed someone like him was just an old soldier. David didn't know. He didn't need to know. He had done his part by being there, by being seen, by being heard, even if only for a moment. The familiar hum of the airport was louder now, the chaos of the crowd settling back into the background. People hurried past him as he made his way toward baggage claim. A few passengers who had overheard the announcement seemed to look at him differently now, some with quiet nods of respect, others with curious glances that quickly turned away. But David didn't care. He wasn't there for validation. He had never been. He was just here to get home. The carousel spun slowly, the baggage moving in a slow, rhythmic pattern. As he stood there, waiting for his bag, a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir?" David turned to see an older man standing next to him, his uniform neatly pressed, a broad smile on his face. He was tall, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to carry a certain weight. The man's voice was gentle, but there was no mistaking the tone of respect in it. "Are you Mr. David Lawson?" the man asked, his smile widening. David was taken aback for a moment. He didn't recognize the man, and he certainly hadn't expected to be addressed in such a familiar way. "Yes," he said slowly, his eyebrows furrowing slightly. "That's me. Can I help you?" The older man extended his hand, a firm but welcoming gesture. "I just wanted to thank you, sir," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I was on the flight and I heard the announcement. I just wanted to say, I respect what you've done. We all should. I'm sorry for the way some people treat you." David looked at him, surprised, then shook his hand. "Thank you, but it's not necessary," he said, trying to be humble, though his voice carried an edge of emotion he couldn't hide. "I've done my part. It's just, not everyone gets it, you know." The man nodded, his eyes darkening with understanding. "I get it. I'm retired Air Force myself. Been through my own share of battles, though they weren't quite like yours. But I know what it's like to be dismissed, to feel like you don't matter anymore once the uniform comes off. I just wanted to let you know that not everyone forgets. Not everyone overlooks the sacrifices you made." David felt the tight knot in his chest loosen just a little. "I appreciate that," he said quietly. "It's been a long road, but I'm just trying to live the best I can now." The older man smiled, giving David's shoulder a brief, reassuring pat. "You've done more than your share, sir, and we're all grateful." As the man turned to leave, David stood still, letting the words sink in. It wasn't a grand gesture, it wasn't some public display of gratitude. It was just one person acknowledging the service of another, and in that moment, it felt like enough, maybe more than enough. The carousel finally slowed to a stop, and David's bag arrived. He grabbed it and slung it over his shoulder, his mind still running over the events of the flight and the strange way everything had unfolded. For a brief moment, he had been a part of something larger than himself, something beyond the humiliation, beyond the jokes, and beyond the disrespect. The pilot's announcement had done what he couldn't have. It had reminded everyone that respect wasn't given based on appearance or age, but based on the things that truly mattered, the things that made someone who they were. As David stepped out of the terminal and into the cool night air, he realized that he didn't need their apology. He didn't need to be recognized or praised for his service. He had already done it for himself. He had fought the battles he was meant to fight, and now he was walking a path of his own choosing. The night felt peaceful. The noise of the world continued, but David had learned that peace wasn't about the world around you. It was about finding the calm inside yourself, even when the noise of life pressed in from all sides. He walked to his car, his footsteps steady, the weight of his past always with him, but no longer a burden. It was simply part of who he was, part of the man he had become. And that man, in this moment, felt stronger than he ever had before. David drove home in a daze, the city lights blurring past him as he navigated the quiet roads. The hum of his car was the only sound in the vast silence of the night. The weight of the past few hours had settled in his bones, and though the ride was short, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease, of something unresolved. He had received an apology, sure, but there was still something nagging at him, something deeper. When he had gotten on that plane, he hadn't expected any of it. He had been prepared for the usual indifference, maybe some strange glances here and there, but never for the audacity of those young people to make him feel so invisible. The announcement from the pilot, David didn't even know how to process it. It had shocked him, yes, but in a way that felt both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. It wasn't about the apology he had received from the woman. It wasn't even about the public acknowledgement. It was about the quiet respect that had been awakened, not just in her but in himself. For so many years, David had carried his experiences in silence, often feeling like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong in this new world of convenience and entitlement. People saw him, but they didn't see him, not truly. The recognition he had received on the plane felt almost surreal, a fleeting moment of understanding that he hadn't asked for, but one that had come when he least expected it. By the time David pulled into his driveway, the stillness of the night had begun to seep into his thoughts. His house was small, modest even, but it was his. It had been his haven after he returned from his service, a quiet place where he could keep the memories of the war at bay, a place where he didn't have to explain. He sat in the car for a moment, not quite ready to leave the comfort of the silence that had enveloped him. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the apology, it was more that he wasn't sure what it really meant. People apologized because they felt they had to, because they realized their mistake in the heat of the moment. But did they really understand? Did she truly grasp what had happened? Did any of them? David sighed deeply, his hand resting on the steering wheel. He had always believed that respect had to be earned, that it wasn't something people just gave because they felt like it. But the truth was, he had fought for that respect, bled for it, and had often been denied it, simply because he didn't fit the mold of what people thought a hero looked like. It had been easier to turn the other cheek, to swallow the hurt and move forward. He had gotten used to it. But on that flight, something inside him had snapped, and for the first time in years, he had felt like he was more than just a man walking through life, quietly battling the ghosts of his past. As he got out of the car and walked up to his front door, the chill of the night air tugged at his jacket. He reached for his keys, but before he could unlock the door, a figure emerged from the shadows of his porch. "David?" David froze for a moment. The voice was familiar, a comforting sound that he hadn't heard in years. He turned, squinting against the darkness. Standing there in the dim light was an older woman, her face slightly hidden under the brim of a hat. It was almost as if time had stopped for a moment, bringing back a memory he wasn't prepared to revisit. "Sarah?" His voice was hoarse, unsure, as though he didn't recognize the woman standing in front of him, even though he knew exactly who she was. She was older now, the lines of age and life etched on her face, but she still held herself the same way, strong, with a quiet dignity that always seemed to anchor her in moments of chaos. She smiled gently, her eyes softening as they met his. "I didn't mean to startle you, it's just, I've been trying to reach you." David stood motionless, unsure of how to respond. His heart raced, the sudden appearance of Sarah throwing him off balance. He hadn't expected anyone tonight, let alone her. She was a reminder of everything he had walked away from when he left, a reminder of the life he had once known before it was torn apart. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice almost inaudible. "I heard about what happened on your flight," she said, her words light but deliberate. "And I thought I'd come by. I didn't want to leave things unsaid. After everything you've been through, I thought it was time to talk." David swallowed hard. "There's nothing to talk about, Sarah. I'm fine. I've made peace with everything." She shook her head slowly, her expression unreadable but calm. "David, you don't have to carry it alone, you know. You never did." The words hit him like a wave, and for a brief moment, he couldn't speak. He hadn't realized how much he had buried inside, how much he had kept from those who truly cared. Maybe it was because he didn't want to burden anyone with the weight of his past. Maybe it was easier to stay silent than to explain. But standing in front of Sarah now, hearing her voice, he felt the vulnerability he had spent years trying to hide. "I've been watching you," she continued softly, her eyes locked on his. "Not in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable, but in a way that makes me want to remind you that you're still here, that you're still important. What happened on that flight wasn't just about you. It was about everyone else too, about how they see things when they don't understand. I know you think you're done, that you've seen it all, but David, there's still so much left for you to give. David shook his head. I'm not who I used to be, Sarah. You don't know what it's like to keep fighting the same battles over and over again. I'm not sure I'm cut out for all this. She took a step closer, her gaze never leaving his. You've been through more than most, David, but you're still standing, and that matters. It matters more than you think. He opened his mouth to respond, but words failed him. The lump in his throat was too thick, the emotions too raw. He didn't know how to express what he was feeling. He had buried it all for so long. Sarah placed a hand gently on his arm, offering a sense of reassurance. You don't have to do this alone. I'm here for you. We're all here for you. In that moment, David realized something. He had been shutting people out for so long, keeping them at arm's length because he feared the vulnerability. But maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to do this alone. Maybe there was still room for healing, still room for him to move forward. He nodded, the first step toward letting go of the weight he had carried for so long. I don't know what's next, David said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. But I'm willing to find out. Sarah smiled, the warmth in her eyes reassuring him that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't walking alone anymore. David nodded, trying to steady his breath as the reality of the moment settled in. Sarah's words lingered in the air between them, her hand still resting gently on his arm. It wasn't just the offer of support that had touched him. It was the understanding, the unspoken recognition that, after all these years, he didn't have to face the world alone anymore. His entire life had been about being self-reliant, about not showing weakness, about shouldering the weight of everything himself. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that it was okay to need help. That sometimes leaning on someone else didn't make you weak, it made you human. You've been through a lot, Sarah said, her voice soft but steady. And I know you don't always show it, but I see it. I've seen it for years, and I can see it now, that you're still holding on, trying to be the man everyone expects you to be. But David, you don't have to be that man alone. The tears which he had so desperately held back for years threatened to come to the surface. He blinked them away quickly, trying to regain control. It was a strange feeling, being able to talk so openly with someone again after so long. He ran a hand through his hair and took a deep breath, the weight of everything still pressing down on him. He had always been the rock for others, the one who stood tall when everything around him was crumbling. But the truth was, he hadn't been standing at all. He had been surviving, drifting through life, weighed down by memories and expectations. I don't know how to do this anymore, Sarah, David said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. I thought I had it figured out, but I've been walking in circles for so long, I'm not sure I even remember what it feels like to move forward. Sarah squeezed his arm gently. It's okay. You don't have to have it all figured out right now, but you're still here. You're still breathing. That's the hardest part. And it's okay to feel lost sometimes. We all do. It's part of being human. David finally allowed himself to let the walls crumble, even if just a little bit. I don't know what happens next. I've spent so many years with my guard up, thinking I could handle it alone. But I'm tired, Sarah. I'm so damn tired. She gave him a small, understanding smile. It's okay to be tired. You don't have to carry it all, and you don't have to do it alone anymore. David felt a deep ache in his chest, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. There was a vulnerability in that moment that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He looked at Sarah, his eyes searching for something, reassurance perhaps, or just the acknowledgement that it was okay to be human, to be weak, to admit that he needed something more than solitude. Thank you, he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. Sarah nodded, her smile still soft. You don't have to thank me, David. We're friends, remember? And that's what friends do for each other. The world outside was still and quiet. The only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. For the first time in a long while, David felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't perfect. There were still things left unsaid, things he hadn't yet worked through. But in that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was room for healing, for forgiveness, for finding a way forward, even if it was slow. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could face it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of quiet reflection and small but meaningful changes. David had always been a man of routine, finding comfort in the predictable. But now something was different. Sarah's presence in his life had been a gentle reminder of the things he had left behind, the things he had hidden away to protect himself. Every conversation with her, every shared moment, felt like a piece of the puzzle falling into place. He started to visit the local veterans center more often, something he hadn't done in years. At first, it felt like he was stepping into unfamiliar territory. The conversations, the stories from other veterans, they reminded him of things he had long since buried. But the more he went, the more he began to feel a sense of connection. He wasn't just the man who had been forgotten on a plane anymore. He was David Lawson, someone who had a place in this world, someone whose experiences mattered. One evening, after another visit to the center, David found himself sitting on his porch, watching the sky change colors as the sun dipped below the horizon. Sarah had stopped by earlier, bringing him a hot meal and sitting with him for a few hours, talking about everything and nothing. It felt so natural, so easy, like nothing had changed, even though everything had. As the night settled in, David's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, surprised to see a message from an unknown number. The message was short, but it was enough to stop him cold. "Mr. Lawson, this is Kyle from the flight you were on a few weeks ago. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I wanted to apologize for my behavior. I know I can't undo it, but I just wanted to let you know that I regret what I did. I wasn't in the right, and I was wrong to treat you that way. I hope you're doing well." David stared at the message for a long time, his fingers hovering over the screen. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe nothing, maybe an apology that didn't feel genuine. But as he read the words again, he realized it was sincere. Kyle hadn't been forced to apologize. He hadn't been pressured. This was his own choice, a recognition of the wrong he had done. David took a deep breath, his thoughts shifting back to the flight, to the couple who had laughed at him, to the sting of their words. But as he thought about it, he realized something. The apology wasn't about fixing the past. It was about what Kyle had learned. It was about the growth that had taken place, not just in him, but in all of them. He tapped out a response. "Thank you, Kyle. Your apology means more than you know. And yes, I'm doing well. I hope you are too. Take care." He hit send, then set his phone down on the table. The night was calm, the stars just beginning to appear in the sky. David sat back in his chair, allowing the peace to settle in around him. He didn't need to carry the weight of the past anymore. He didn't need to hold on to the hurt, the anger, or the resentment. He had learned that true strength came not from carrying everything alone, but from allowing himself to let go, to heal, and to accept that he didn't have to be perfect. The message from Kyle was just the beginning of something else. It wasn't about closure, it was about understanding, about acknowledging that mistakes had been made, and that it was possible to move forward from them. David stood up, stretching his legs and walking inside. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready for it. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a place in it. He wasn't defined by his past anymore. He was David Lawson, a man who had served, a man who had been wounded, but a man who had learned that respect wasn't just about the recognition he received from others. It was about how he saw himself. As he turned off the lights and settled into bed, the weight on his chest felt lighter. Tomorrow would come, and whatever it brought, he knew he could face it. End of story.